Rus. The first Ukrainians invaded Kursk, launching their drones at several targets on the border and advancing into Russian territory. Their reconnaissance and sabotage groups set up ambushes that destroyed Russian convoys and support forces. Bridges were destroyed to encircle Kremlin troops trapped between the Ukrainian border and the Seine River. The frightening speed encouraged other attempts, one of them inside Belgorod, with an armored vehicle heading at high speed toward the Russian checkpoint at the border. In these cases, the Ukrainians encountered prepared enemies, with mortars unleashing a storm of death on their heads. The challenges of fighting on the country's borders intensified the violence of the war in the middle of summer. Ukraine invaded Russia from the Kursk Oblast on August 6, 2024, and the immediate comments describe that these soldiers wouldn't last a week. Even the Russian Ministry of Defense itself stated that they had been expelled. But after a month of fighting in the region, with so many deaths on both sides, what happened was only the expansion of the area dominated by the Kursk, of the strangeness of war, surprising not only experienced analysts, but also war veterans trained in Call of Duty and Free Fire. Of course, in the midst of this event that boosted Ukraine's morale, there were so many bigger problems. The Russians' daily advance toward Pokrovsk continued at a speed that hadn't been seen since the early days of the invasion in 2020. Control over the city, often referred to by the Russian media as the gateway to Donetsk, would allow Moscow to significantly cut off the supply routes of Ukrainian forces on the eastern front line. In addition, this control would strengthen the Russian offensive to take Chasiv-Yar, a city located on high ground, which could provide an advantage. Defenses around Vyridar, one of the major Ukrainian strongholds south of Donetsk, were beginning to fall. The city was suffering from the possibility of being completely surrounded after years of fierce defense, famous for filling the fields with destroyed Russian equipment. The great Russian failure was still evident at this moment. The Russian failure continued at this moment. The urgency dried up the power. I was never retaliated against single. The stratagem gained with the battle of war. Zanoto. The invasion of Kursk led to new Ukrainian attempts to enter Belgorod Oblast, from where the Russians had begun the invasion of Kharkiv. The place had seen previous incursions. The success in Kursk at the beginning of August encouraged new attempts to enter the territory. A tank in the village of Mirom was prepared to protect the border, but it wasn't ready for a kamikaze drone to cross the imaginary lines and break through its armor. In the same location, a GAZ 3308 truck was detected by the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, hitting the parked vehicle and causing another Russian loss was easy. The same brigade hit another Russian vehicle that was transporting troops at the border. Less than 20 minutes from there, in Bochkovka, Russian soldiers tried to move to keep the border patrols active. A drone intercepted them, giving them just enough time to jump out of the vehicle and watch it explode. The Ukrainians even claimed that they had taken control of the village of Poros, 2.5 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. But the bravado didn't last long.
They left.
Shortly after, ambitious plans were made at the Kish. The Ukrainians tried a new approach, a bit farther from those initial attacks. The bold move began with an armored vehicle speeding toward the checkpoint. The path was blocked by a mine, which exploded with such force that it was surprising how the vehicle was still able to move for a while and keep the soldiers inside alive. The fire was still burning on the road when the Ukrainians sought cover to continue their advance. A mortar round landed among the men. The two fell and spent their last minutes of life on the border with Russia. Another armored vehicle with reinforcements approached, passing the destroyed first one. This one wasn't stopped by the mines, but by the blockade the Russians had created. It was a brutal crash. The jolt shook the soldiers' skeletons, causing bruises on their bodies. The men disembarked and tried to come up with a strategy to advance under Russian fire. The mortar fire came next, hitting hard among the men. The Ukrainians tried to move through all the smoke and gunfire. One of them ran across the grass, deafened by the explosions. The next mortar found him, and his body disappeared into the smoke. New attacks on the checkpoint, now with the support of a BTR, were unsuccessful. The vehicles were stopped halfway. The men abandoned one of the armored vehicles. They moved panting through the mortar explosions. Smoke was all around them, rising every time one of their own fell to the ground. Unable to find cover, they went to the BTR trying to carry the wounded. A drone flew over the road and hit the armored vehicle, ending the last hope of a quick escape from there. The overconfidence from the success in Kursk led to this disaster in Belgorod. There, the Russians were better prepared due to the Kharkiv offensive and the incursions the previous year. The Ukrainians did not give up on tormenting their enemies. There, Chechens were seen mistreating a cat, which brought them the bad luck of being found by a kamikaze drone. The 92 and Assault Brigade saw Russian soldiers moving near the border. Their drones were hunting enemies to take them out. The explosion took out two of them as they tried to escape.
Escaping from a drone wasn't easy.
Two of those soldiers walked through the bushes, trying not to be seen by the demons hunting in the sky. When the drone signal was detected, they had to hide quickly to avoid becoming prey, like their comrades. It seemed like the Ukrainians were hunting to vent their frustration over the deaths at the checkpoints. Their drones found any place where the soldiers were hiding and dropped their explosives there. None of this was enough for a new incursion or a significant attack on Belgorod. Ukrainians still had to deal with the Russians in other locations, and one of the most favorable seemed to be Kursk, where the idea was to surround and flank the enemy positions. As the invasion of Kursk expanded westward toward Glushko, the Ukrainians came up with a plan to confront the Russian troops stationed there. The goal was to surround these soldiers between the banks of the Seine River and the Ukrainian border. To do this, they intended to launch attacks from two sides. On one side was Tiotikino, on the banks of the Seine. The place had just under 6,000 inhabitants, plus the presence of troops due to its proximity to the border. At the end of 2023, the Ukrainians began to send their drones to take down the communication and detection system. The Russian military deployed long-range visual surveillance systems called Burom-P. These were hit by Ukrainian kamikaze drones. The drone pilots patrolled the area, even with few conflicts. The Russians remained alert as they sent their drones toward the border checkpoints. One of the drones crashed into one of them, scaring the guards in the area.
Calm, but without leaving any victims.
The Russians tried to start some defenses, but their equipment was attacked. In the winter, the 110th Territorial Defense Brigade released their drones into the air, breaking through the falling snow as they flew, hunting for targets to blow up. The fire of war struck military vehicles, breaking the monotonous colors with the red and yellow of the flames. The surveillance systems suffered explosive impacts in different positions in the village and at the military posts. A soldier got out of the car to patrol and spotted the drone approaching in time. He escaped the deadly visit just in time to realize he would have to walk home. Other men at the watch posts were not so lucky, feeling the heat and shrapnel right in front of them. Snow was still falling in the early months of 2024 when the Russian Freedom Legion launched its attacks. The drones hit their targets, signaling to the locals that something worse was coming. The military vehicles were identified, along with their crew, parking along the tree lines. They seemed calm when the kamikaze drones descended upon the people, and the BMP-2, guarding that quiet border, was becoming more difficult every day. The Legion's artillery was deployed against the ammunition depots inside Tyokhino. The few inhabitants of the city saw the explosions erupt, surprised by the increase in violence. The explosions became increasingly severe. Houses with ammunition caught fire. Then, unleashing the fury of the detonations, the fire grew, letting the columns of smoke heat up the cold air at the end of winter. Some young people were impressed, while the more sensible ones ran for shelter. Shortly after, a video appeared showing the men of the Russian Freedom Legion in combat. They entered the small houses that had been abandoned for so long, raising their rifles to fire. The ammunition made its noise as the men moved, looking for defensive positions and more protected spots. To make their rifles threaten the lives of the Kremlin soldiers, there were arguments that the combat had not been real. But later, videos also emerged of the Russians responsible for protecting the border fleeing. They were less prepared men, many of them young, who encountered soldiers hardened by previous incursions in Belgorod and by the fighting in Donetsk. The Legion's flag was even displayed as a provocation. The snow stopped, and the deeper incursions into the territory stopped as well. Months later, with green already covering the fields, the Ukrainians deployed drones for airstrikes throughout the settlement. There were explosive drops on various targets. Kiev's drones searched for many of the watch posts. Communication equipment was damaged and destroyed. Surveillance systems began to blind the Russians. Some distracted soldiers were spotted by the Ukrainians. Their kamikaze drones crashed into the doors of their shelters. The explosions shut down the activities of some military areas in Tyokhino. Suddenly, there was a narrow strip of land controlled by the Ukrainians inside Kursk. With the invasion on August 6, 2012, this area expanded in several directions, eventually heading westward. Ukrainian drones managed to fly over Glushkovo. Their flight over the city was smooth, with no electronic interference, until they ended up inside a Russian vehicle. Others recorded the fiery result of that encounter. Power stations were also hit in the city. Soon after, the bridges over the Seine River came alive again, then began to be destroyed. First, there were strikes that damaged the passage, leaving large holes in the concrete. Since the Russians insisted on using the site, the Ukrainian Air Force dropped their bombs to blow up the structure, With so many bridges destroyed, the Russians had to think of other options to cross the rivers and meet the needs of their troops. On the other side of the riverbank, the Ukrainian Air Force was destroyed. They started building temporary bridges to make the crossings, but the Ukrainians attacked with the same vigor. Cluster munitions spread among the vehicles and the river, destroying everything that had been prepared. The shrapnel and spheres flew against bodies in armor. The Russians sent more of these engineering groups as these bridges were essential. In response, the Ukrainians made the river's propellers. The drones spun rapidly in search of destruction. The drones searched for the vehicles that tried to cross the bridges, which were already prepared. Equipment used for building the crossings was pursued by loitering munitions. There was a game of trying to build on one side and destroy on the other. The results were viewed with concern by the Russian soldiers, who insisted on the process in an attempt to help their comrades trapped on the other side of the river. Meanwhile, the equipment stranded on the banks and unable to cross was hunted by drone operators. The Ukrainians managed to create an area that was difficult for the Russians to access. The left bank of the Sena still had many troops, and they needed to be supplied and take part in rotations. The plans to expel the Russians from the League. The advance was still slow on that side. In other areas, the fighting remained fierce, with the Russians bombarding the Ukrainians even more intensely. The Ukrainian columns moved through Kursk, trying to continue the advances from different positions. There was heavy resistance in Kornivo, Malaya, Loknia, and south of Sudsa in the third week of the invasion. The Ukrainians had to face more organized forces, with the 56th Guards Air Assault Regiment, the 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade, and the 22nd Guards Infantry Brigade. Forces from these groups used the Pos-1 to open fire on Ukrainian columns, causing the loss of vehicles and casualties inside Russian territory. The pressure against the advance of Kiev soldiers was powerful. In modern warfare, eyes were everywhere. This made the effect of the weapons more efficient, sending drones for a quick and precise flight. They could be launched from anywhere. Their fiery landing on Ukrainian vehicles broke the advance of more than one column, Ovizadush. Part of the Ukrainian advances consisted of highly mobile pickup trucks with improvised rocket launchers. These teams tried to move quickly across the terrain to attack Russian forces and allow the infantry to strike. The vehicles still at work, detected by enemy drones, suffered from Lancet strikes, which were sent to destroy the threats. The constant drone attacks made the Ukrainians slow down the intensity of their advances. In the southern region of Sudza, there was a sudden stop in Bort. Since the second week, the constant Russian strikes have created a barrier in Bort. It was a complex situation. The Lancets were constantly in the sky, diving, whenever they spotted armored vehicles like the BTR-60P, which was blown up on the highway. Many soldiers inside the vehicles experienced these impacts, feeling the heat and the shaking. Saved by the armor, they ran to the tree lines to stay out of sight of the drones. These fighters were lucky because much of the equipment actually withstood the impacts well, becoming unusable but keeping the men alive. Others, still stunned, took longer to comply. From above, demons smaller than the Lancet, but still deadly, descended to claim their lives in the midst of the smoke. The Ukrainians lost all chance of entering Korenivo i Italy. With a Russian counteroffensive on September 10, something that coincided with the loss of territory. Further west, northeast, and east, the Ukrainians launched new offensives. One of their tanks headed toward Olgovka, where it stopped in the fields and fired its cannon. That was a PT-91 Twardy tank, a Polish version of the T-72. The Russian drone watched the attack until the kamikaze was able to get close enough to explode over the armored vehicle. That tank was manufactured in Poland, but it had the Soviet legacy of explosions that sent the turrets flying into the air. The flames and smoke kept the signs of war alive, approaching Olgovka and Kremianoi. Another T-72 that tried to move forward was stopped. The crew fled before the kamikaze appeared to finally blow up the machine. A Russian BMP that tried to approach to help the soldiers in Kremianoi was surprised by the kamikaze drone while still on the way. It joined the enemy armored vehicles burning in the fields east of Korenivo. The Ukrainian advances gave the drone operators of the 95th Brigade and the soldiers space to find a good spot to prepare their kamikazes. With the equipment ready and their eyes glued to the screens, they let the drones fly. A howitzer was detected and quickly destroyed. A group of Russians hideout had the unpleasant entrance of a kamikaze drone. Another one invaded a house through the window, ending the rest of the Moscow soldiers. The others, who were still hunting Ukrainians in the air, intended to continue northeast and prevent reinforcements from arriving in that combat sector. A Vampire attack hexacopter flew to Kalchuk, where it dropped an anti-tank mine on the road. A Russian T-64, which didn't notice the trap, was engulfed by flames. By mid-September, the Ukrainians had surrounded the Russian troops who were still bravely defending Kremenoi. The front line in the direction of Malaya Lochnia was anything but easy. The Ukrainians tried to advance with their tanks firing. Arriving in Cherkassk and Peletnoy, they encountered heavy resistance. The T-64BV was hit directly by a Lancer during the advance. A brutal hit disabled the tank and made the crew flee for good. They hurried before the ammunition cooked off and completely detonated the vehicle. That didn't stop the march on Kiev. There were Russians almost surrounded and still holding out in Malaya Lochnia, Cherkassk, and Peletnoy. It was a flank that needed to be secured to put an end to the resistance there. The Russian soldiers trying to defend the area were pursued by the drones of the 225th Assault Battalion. The explosives went off in the middle of the fields, expanding the wave of death that swept away the soldiers. They had to crawl to the tree line, one of them dragging his twisted leg, terrified to see his limb shot, which, well, he would probably lose in exchange for a medal. The Ukrainians' good advance was helped by drones. Therefore, destroying electronic warfare systems like the R330 ZHGTEL was necessary, an important step in the process. One of them was found among the trees and blown up, making the job easier for the Ukrainian flying demons. With the observers in the air, it was easy to locate the BMPs. With Russian reinforcements coming to help the 810 soldiers trapped in Malaya Lochnia, the kamikazes went to welcome them to the battle in the village. The Ukrainian special forces were also able to advance. Russian military trucks on the road. The shots came from the bushes, flying swiftly to bring death to the Russian crew members. The shots hit the driver and sent the vehicle to the side of the road. The truck was left crashed among the trees, still under Ukrainian fire. The Russians tried to resist, A powerful shot from the Ukrainians exploded at the rear, throwing enemy soldiers to the ground. The siege was closing in. The war began to say goodbye to the Russians as the projectiles entered their bodies. A thrown grenade deafened the men and left some of them staggering. Machine gun fire completely destroyed their balance. More corpses illustrated the tragedy of war on Russian soil. Ukrainians approached the vehicle illuminated by the flames to finish the job too. Those who tried to cross the street to the other side were chased by rifles until they became part of the dead. The soldiers turned to the burning truck, making sure the enemies were finished and collecting the trophies. The Ukrainian glide bombs were also coming into action in Kursk. The guided bomb unit 39 could glide for more than 100 kilometers, quietly carrying 100 kg of explosives. The guided bomb unit insertion against the truck with support continued with the drones. They turned into huge fires on the road to the point where Malaya Lokna became a lost position. Some of the bears still managed to get out of the area, but at the cost of so many of their own lives. And some who stayed inside the building, surrounded by the swarm of drones buzzing in the air. The flying demons were small threats in flight, but they had the precision of the Society of Death, tearing apart the buildings in Malaya Lokna, where the last Russians who refused to surrender would be buried and burned. The city was taken over and held. By mid-September, the Eastern Front seemed consolidated for the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, in the west, a new battle, including Kurskovo and Snagost, was unfolding with strategies that many awaited the outcome of. Everything could change with surprises. On this front, where mobility was an essential weapon, unlike the trench warfare in Donbass, the Russian counteroffensive remained strong and more battles were promised on the Western Front. The Ukrainians needed to make a decision. Winter was coming, and all their logistics would get worse as reinforcements began to build up. The fighting would be tough, and the decisions to continue or withdraw would be even harder to make. The most ironic thing about the Battle of Kursk was seeing the war propaganda near the roads calling on the Russians to fight and show their patriotic valor. They returned the bodies of those who answered the call. Not far from those Russian corpses, there were also Ukrainian dead thrown in another country where they might never be recovered. For the family's farewell. The call of violence and the farewell to life were the only constants a man could expect from war.